In this video, we examine the most stupid amusement park deaths ever recorded, from a teenager who stacked 2 tubes on a water slide after being told not to a man who crossed an active roller coaster track to retrieve his hat, a detour that ended his ride in the most avoidable way possible. It was June 2016 at an outdoor water park in Florida. The park was running at full capacity on a weekday afternoon with heavy heat and most of the foot traffic concentrated around the larger slide attractions on the east end of the property. The lines for the multi-lane tube slides had been building since late morning. Kevin Dellin was 19 years old and worked part-time stocking shelves at a home goods store. He came to the water park several times each summer, often alone, and knew the layout well enough to move through it efficiently. It was one of the few places he spent money on without hesitation. He had a habit of approaching rides in a way that suggested the standard experience was never quite enough and had been corrected by attendants at least twice earlier that same visit for attempting to modify how a ride was used. The attraction was a 6-lane open-top tube slide where riders descended a 220-foot flume into a run-out pool designed for one rider and one tube at a time. The low side walls allowed little margin beyond the standard seated height. Kevin had already ridden it 3 times. On his 4th approach, he picked up 2 tubes from the platform stack. When the attendant told him to put one back, he briefly set it down, waited for the attendant to look away, then picked it up again and moved toward his lane. He positioned one tube inside the entry channel and nested the second on top of the first, raising his seated position roughly 6 inches above the standard ride posture. The combined stack was less stable than a single tube because the upper tube had no fixed connection to the lower one and could shift independently under lateral force. The attendant noticed and moved toward him, but Kevin pushed off before he could be stopped. The attendant radioed the base of the slide. The flume was open top for its entire length on this particular attraction, with sidewalls approximately 14 inches above the water channel floor. At the standard seated height, a rider's torso clears the wall by only a few inches, which is enough when the tube stays centered in the channel. Kevin's elevated position changed that margin entirely. His torso sat several inches above the wall line before the ride even began moving at speed. Within the first 30 feet, at a banked left curve, the stacked tube configuration shifted toward the outer wall under lateral force. The upper tube slid outward, and the lower tube's outer edge made contact with the top of the sidewall. Kevin, seated above the normal ride line, tipped over the outer wall of the flume. He fell approximately 9 feet onto the concrete service apron running alongside the slide structure, landing on his right shoulder and chest. The upper tube separated and continued down the slide independently. Riders in adjacent lanes and several people on the platform above observed him go over the wall. Attendants at the base had already been alerted by radio and reached him within seconds of the fall. By the time the attendant reached the base platform, Kevin lay motionless on the concrete service apron beside the slide structure. Emergency services were requested immediately as staff cleared the surrounding lanes and secured the area. Paramedics arrived and initiated advanced life support while supervisors directed guests away from the run-out pool. Despite continued intervention, his condition deteriorated from severe internal trauma sustained during the fall. He was pronounced dead at the scene. Investigators later confirmed that Kevin had intentionally stacked 2 tubes despite repeated instruction from staff, raising his seated position above the flume wall and reducing lateral stability during the first banked turn. The medical examiner determined that death resulted from blunt force trauma to the chest, including cardiac contusion and hemothorax caused by the impact with the concrete apron. Following the incident, the park modified tube storage procedures to prevent riders from removing more than 1 tube at a time. Ignoring a staff warning cost a 19-year-old his life at the bottom of a water slide. At a state fair in Tennessee 2 years later, a man was about to apply the same logic to something with a lot more height. It was October 2018 at a state fairgrounds in Tennessee. The Midway was running its final night session of the weekend, and the crowds had thinned considerably by 10 o'clock. leaving mostly groups of younger adults and a few stragglers from earlier in the evening. The air had cooled as most of the food stalls along the outer edge of the midway began closing down. Todd Bremer was 29 years old and worked as a freelance handyman, picking up jobs through word of mouth and rarely holding more than 2 or 3 in a week. He spent most of his free time at bars or outdoor events and had shown up to the fair that night with 2 friends and no particular plan. Todd had a tendency to treat anything with a mechanical or structural component as something he already understood well enough, a confidence that came from years of working on rooftops and ladders and that he applied broadly to situations that were not the same thing at all. The group had been on the midway for a couple of hours when they stopped near the Ferris wheel toward the end of the evening. The ride was in its final loading rotation of the night, moving slowly as attendants filled the remaining gondolas. Todd began studying the outer frame of the wheel while the group stood at the perimeter. The frame was a standard spoke and rim construction with diagonal cross-bracing between the spokes, creating a series of accessible handholds from the ground up. Todd told his friends that climbing to one of the upper gondolas from the outside would be straightforward. His friends did not take him seriously. Todd finished his drink, set the cup on a nearby trash barrel, and walked to the side of the ride furthest from the operator booth. There was a low chain barrier running around the perimeter of the ride that Todd stepped over without breaking stride. The operator was inside the booth on the far side of the wheel and had no sight line to where Todd was standing. The nearest fair worker was managing the adjacent ride and had his back turned. He gripped the lowest cross member of the outer frame and pulled himself up while the wheel was still in its slow loading rotation. He moved between the cross braces steadily, treating each diagonal member as a rung. The frame moved beneath him as the wheel turned, but the rotation was slow enough during loading that the movement was manageable. He climbed approximately 35 feet, reaching a position near the upper section of the wheel's arc. He stopped and held a vertical strut with both hands. At that height, the gondola arms extended outward at regular intervals, and the wind coming across the open fairgrounds was more noticeable than it had been at ground level. The operator, having finished loading the final gondolas, brought the wheel up to its standard operating speed. As the wheel reached normal operating speed, the frame began moving faster beneath him. The change in speed was gradual, but the effect on the frame was immediate. The cross brace beneath Todd's left foot shifted angle as the wheel accelerated and his foot slid outward along the member. He reached for an adjacent strut with his right hand, but his left grip was already failing. He lost contact with the frame and fell from approximately 35 feet. He landed feet first on the concrete pad beside the base of the ride structure. The impact transmitted the full force of the fall through both legs and into his pelvis and lower spine. He remained upright briefly before collapsing. Witnesses on the midway and several riders in the upper gondolas observed the fall. Todd was conscious and able to speak when fair workers reached him. He died approximately 4 hours later from a traumatic aortic injury caused by the compression force transmitted through his spine on landing. Both legs sustained complete fractures at the point of impact. The case was ruled an accidental death. No charges were filed against the fair operator. Climbing a Ferris wheel uninvited put a man in the ground 4 hours after he hit the concrete. Meanwhile, in Texas, a woman who never accepted no for an answer was working on a shortcut that was about to run out of floor. It was July 2015 at a large theme park in Texas. The park was running its extended night hours on a holiday weekend, and the crowds near the major coaster attractions had grown through the afternoon and showed no sign of thinning by early evening. The lines for the larger rides had stretched well past their queue barriers by 7 o'clock, and the heat that had sat over the area all day had barely let up even after sundown. Renata Villach was 38 years old and worked as an office administrator at a freight company outside of Houston. She had been putting together group outings for her department for the better part of 3 years, a role nobody had assigned her, but that she had taken on anyway and defended as though it were in her job description. The theme park trip had been her idea from the start. She had sent the invitation, collected the money, printed a loose itinerary, and arrived that morning as the first one at the meeting point. For Renata, the point of organizing something was not just to participate in it, but to make sure it ran the way she had envisioned. She was not someone who accepted delays or detours gracefully, and a 75-minute wait was not part of how she had planned the evening. The group had already ridden the suspended looping coaster earlier, and one member suggested going again. Renata checked the wait time, glanced at the long queue, and told the group she knew a faster way in. She believed the exit ramp's maintenance corridor would reconnect near the loading platform and allow her to bypass the line. The maintenance corridor, she had noticed, did not connect to the loading platform in any usable way. Even if she had made it up the ramp without incident, she would have hit a locked service door well before reaching the station. The corridor led only to a locked service door before the station. She waited for a gap in departing riders, told a nearby attendant she had dropped her phone, and slipped through the one-way exit gate before a response came. She then moved up the inclined ramp against the normal flow of foot traffic. The exit ramp ran parallel to the final section of the coaster's track for most of its length. At one point, the ramp narrowed into a curve where a horizontal pipe railing ran at approximately hip height along the outer edge. The ramp surface at this section carried a steeper incline than the rest of the path, and the curve reduced visibility of what lay ahead. Renata was moving at a brisk pace and looking toward the platform further up the ramp rather than at the surface beneath her feet. The combination of the incline and her forward momentum caused her to lose her footing and pitch into the outer railing. The railing shifted under her weight and separated from its mounting bracket at a fastening point along the outer wall of the ramp. Renata went over the side and fell approximately 11 feet into a concrete utility channel below, landing on her right side and abdomen. Riders on the platform signaled for help as attendants cleared the exit ramp and stopped guests from moving through the area. A call for medical support went out over the park radio, and paramedics arrived within minutes, carrying stabilization equipment down the service path beside the ride. Renata was conscious but in visible distress as they secured her to a backboard and prepared her for transport. She was moved through a service gate to a waiting ambulance while the attraction remained temporarily closed, and supervisors began documenting the scene. She survived the initial fall, but died roughly 19 hours later from internal hemorrhaging caused by injuries sustained on impact. A structural review conducted afterward identified pre-existing metal fatigue and internally corroded fasteners at the railing's mounting point. Following the incident, maintenance procedures at the attraction were re-evaluated and the damaged section of railing was removed and replaced. Renata Villach fell through a railing on an exit ramp she had no business being on and never made it out of the following day. 2 years later in Georgia, a man with a cooler full of drinks and something to prove was about to turn a lazy river into the last argument he ever started. If you've made it this far, you already know where this is going. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. It was August 2017 at an outdoor water park in Georgia. The park was near full capacity on a Sunday afternoon, with most visitors gathered around the wave pool and the lazy river on the south end of the property. Shaded seating filled early, and long lines formed across the main attractions. Carl Mesple was 51 years old and ran a small pressure washing business out of his home in the suburbs of Macon. People who knew Carl described him as someone who was difficult to argue with, not because he made strong points, but because he simply did not stop talking until the other person gave up. He had never been particularly athletic, but spoke about his physical condition in a way that suggested he believed otherwise. His son had organized the day trip and invited 2 family friends along. He had arrived at the park with a soft-sided cooler that passed through the entrance checkpoint with the rest of the group. By early afternoon, the group had settled near the Lazy River attraction, a looping channel roughly 600 feet in circumference, 4 feet deep, and designed to carry riders on inner tubes at a continuous current of approximately 2.5 miles per hour. The attraction ran on a recirculating pump system that maintained consistent flow throughout the day. A lifeguard was stationed on an elevated stand with a clear sight line across most of the loop. The entry point had a tube stack where riders were expected to pick one up before getting in. A debate started within the group about whether a person could walk the full loop against the current rather than float with it. Carl said it would be easy and that the current was not moving fast enough to be a real obstacle. His son told him to drop it. One of the family friends changed the subject. Carl finished what was left in his cup, set it on the deck, removed his shirt, left his sandals beside the cooler, and walked toward the channel entry point. A lifeguard on the nearby stand called out that inner tubes were required for all riders. Carl waved a hand in the direction of the stand without turning around and stepped into the water without one. He entered against the current, which pressed steadily against his chest almost immediately. The water level sat between his chest and shoulders. For the first 100 feet, he made visible progress, planting each step carefully and using the channel wall occasionally for balance. The effort was considerably more than he had anticipated, and his pace slowed noticeably before he reached the first curve. At that section, the current naturally accelerated around the bend. Carl lost his footing on the smooth concrete floor. Lazy river channels are typically coated with a surface finish that resists algae, which also significantly reduces traction for bare feet under moving water. He went under briefly, resurfaced, but was now being carried by the current rather than walking against it. Water rushed past loud enough that nearby riders turned to look. He attempted to plant his feet and stand a second time in a section where the channel floor dropped another 8 inches, causing the current to push faster through the bend. His footing gave way again. Witnesses floating in tubes nearby and several people standing on the deck above observed him go under and not resurface on his own. His body moved with the current for roughly 40 feet before coming to rest against a deflector near the next bend in the channel. Carl was removed from the water unresponsive and was pronounced dead. His son and the 2 family friends who had arrived with him were escorted from the attraction area shortly afterward. The cause of death was listed as drowning. A blood alcohol level recorded during examination was more than twice the legal driving limit. The case was ruled an accidental death. The park received a formal notice regarding enforcement of the tube requirement policy, but faced no further administrative action. Waving off a lifeguard and stepping into a lazy river without a tube left a man face down in 4 feet of water. Up in Ohio, a man standing at a ride exit was staring at a $12 hat and doing the same kind of math. It was July 2016 at a busy regional amusement park in Ohio. A hot Saturday drew full-capacity crowds, with adults filling the major steel coaster queues while families gathered near water attractions. Wait times passed an hour, and long lines stretched beyond barriers across the coaster section. That day overall, Dennis Prull was 44 years old and worked as a warehouse floor supervisor at a distribution facility outside Columbus. He spent most of his weekends running errands or sitting at home, and the park visit had been arranged by a co-worker who needed someone to accompany a group of younger kids. People who worked with Dennis described him as someone who rarely followed a process he hadn't personally approved of, and who treated most workplace rules as suggestions unless he had seen them cause a problem firsthand. He was not someone who asked for help with things he believed he could handle himself. During a ride in the front row of a steel coaster, Dennis lost his baseball cap mid-ride. It flew off its speed and landed visibly on a flat section of track near the final brake run, roughly 30 feet from the exit ramp. After the ride ended and the group moved toward the exit, Dennis stayed behind. He watched the hat sitting on the track through 2 more full ride cycles without it moving. A ride attendant told him the hat would be collected at the end of the operating day. Dennis acknowledged this and said nothing further. He stood at the exit ramp for another few minutes, watching the hat. It was a plain navy cap he had owned for several years, worth maybe $12. The attendant's solution was reasonable, and he knew it. He also knew the hat was sitting in a spot that looked, from where he was standing, completely accessible. To Dennis, the end-of-day offer felt like an unnecessary wait for a problem he could solve in under 2 minutes. He spent the next several minutes walking the perimeter fence around the ride structure. On the far side of the coaster, partially screened by a maintenance shed and a row of shrubs, he found a gap between the fence and the shed wall wide enough to pass through. He waited until the ride operator stepped inside the control booth during a loading pause, then moved through the gap and onto the gravel service path running alongside the track structure. Dennis moved along the service path, staying close to the support beams. The hat was sitting at the base of a banked curve near the brake section, and he reached it without difficulty. He picked it up and turned back toward the gap in the fence. To get around a low support beam crossing the path, he stepped across the track structure to get around the low support beam. From where he was standing, the track looked clear in both directions. A low metallic rumble carried through the structure as the next train rolled down from the lift. From ground level, approaching train trains released from the station were difficult to see until they had already entered the brake run. At that moment, a second train, already loaded and released from the station, cleared the lift hill and entered the brake run. Coaster trains in brake run sections typically travel between 15 and 30 miles per hour before the brakes engage, depending on a ride design. Dennis was on the track surface when the leading car reached his position. The leading car struck his left side and drove him into a steel support structure beside the track. The train completed its braking sequence and came to a full stop in the brake run, as designed. Several people in the boarding queue and a small group on a viewing bridge adjacent to the coaster observed a figure fall beside the track and did not see him move afterward. The ride operator halted the ride within seconds of the train stopping. Dennis was pronounced dead at the scene. The cause was listed as blunt force trauma sustained from contact with a moving ride vehicle while in a restricted zone without authorization. The case was ruled an accidental death. The park received a citation for the unsecured gap in the perimeter fencing. No charges were filed against any park employee. Thanks for watching. If you like these stories, click here.